Okay, we can start. So good evening, everyone. We are at the last conference of this day, and I cannot actually wait to start it because it's going to be very interesting. I am Nadia Dalla Gasperina, and I am a member of the Hikma Association. As we are having this conversation online, this is an easy way actually to introduce the topic of tonight, which is going to be technology, one of the main pillars of our summit. Technology, digital means and systems are present in our everyday life as citizens, workers and students. I therefore want to thank Professor David Murakami Wood for being here with us and for letting us explore the topic of ethics of surveillance. This is a subtle theme, as in fact, we are not always aware of its existence. On the one hand, surveillance helps governors and companies to upgrade the safety and quality of the services in cities, but on the other hand, it may interfere with privacy and the life of the citizens. Professor David Murakami Wood will help us delve into this thanks to his expertise on the matter. He is in fact an associate professor in the sociology department at Queen's University, where he also collaborates with the and is a core member of its Big Data Surveillance Partnership. He is also a Canada Research Chair in Surveillance Studies, a founding editor and current co-editor-in-chief of Surveillance and Society, the international open access peer-reviewed journal of surveillance studies, and a founder member of the Surveillance Studies Network. He is a member of the Surveillance Studies Center, a global hub for research on expanding surveillance practices. He is author of many academic articles and books about such topics, among them Globalization and Surveillance, The Watch the World. So as you can see, his curriculum is pretty big and we are really excited to have him here. And I really want to thank Professor David Murakami Wood for being here with us today. And I'm really excited to learn about more surveillance in the cities, its ethical and geopolitical implications, as we're going to see with this conversation. As young students and researchers, we want to take this opportunity to gain valuable insights into a topic which is not, in my opinion, so well known, and approach your speech with critical thinking and a positive attitude to the future in the name of the three pillars of Hikma. And I also want to thank our public. In this regard, just some technical info. You can ask your questions by using the platform Slido. You are seeing now the main slide there, and you will find the QR code that you can use by clicking on it with your phone, or you can also type into the website application of Slido, and there you can actually ask your questions. After the conference, I will read out the main questions. And that is about Slido. Moreover, after the speech, there will also be a pop-up questions that serves the purpose of checking attendance. So please answer it. And without further ado, I think we can start the speech, and let's turn to Professor David Murakami Wood. Enjoy your time here.
Right, let's start again. Good evening. I'm really delighted to be speaking to you tonight, and I'm particularly delighted to be speaking about such an important topic. This first slide that you're looking at is a picture from the South China Morning Post, part of the coverage of the Hong Kong protests from 2019. And in this picture, you can see protesters who've taken down a smart lamppost. And this is a lamppost which has various other functions than just providing light, including surveillance cameras, in some cases microphones, and many other possible functions. That South China Morning Post editorial itself claims that the protesters don't understand these devices, that they're being needlessly destructive and they're destroying something that is for the public benefit. But I'm arguing, and what I'm going to talk about more in this talk, is that in fact the protesters may well understand more about what these devices do than the journalists in this case. So my talk is really about smart technology and urban governance. It's a subject I've been thinking about for more than 20 years in some ways, but it's taken on a new dimension in recent years. And what I'm particularly going to discuss today is the phenomenon that I'm calling the platform city, the underpinning of almost every aspect of urban life with smart technology and the kind of problems and possibilities that that creates. So first, I'm going to start with some brief theoretical propositions. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what we would understand now as the smart city and the prehistory of that smart city, and discuss how smart cities have become increasingly, as I'm saying, platform cities. I'm then going to go through 5 case studies, and really they're just examples. I mean, case studies makes them sound too big. And these will be Cyborg Toronto, the recently collapsed project that was supposed to build a smart city in Toronto in Canada. Nevada Innovation Zones, a proposal for creating private governments in Nevada. The private city platform called Prospero. The rather strange Saudi Arabian 170-kilometer linear city project known as NEOM. And finally, Japan's National Super City Initiative. And but finally, I'm going to end up with a kind of critique, which I'm calling platform city blues. So what are my basic theoretical propositions? These are the things that sort of underpin what I'm going to talk about today. And I start by really arguing after Deleuze that we're living in a post-panoptic society now, a society in which control, that is the management of flows, which essentially anything from people, goods, services is the primary kind of job of management of society. This is different from the model proposed by Foucault back in Discipline and Punish, when he drew on Bentham's panopticon and on other models to look at how morality was supposed to be inculcated and put into people to make them into better citizens. In Deleuze's control society, really it doesn't matter if people are better or worse, it just matters that they flow in the right way. And part of this is the breaking down of people and things into their constituents, and particularly data constituents, so that we become what Deleuze calls dividuals, divided individuals made up of codes. Theorists like Alex Galloway have taken this forward and talked about how the world is becoming increasingly protocological, that is based on protocols. And this, if you understand, is the way in which the internet works. There are not so much laws as such, but there are kind of computer generated protocols which allow us to do certain things and restrict us from others. And I've argued, and what I'll draw on today, is that we're now living in a society of spatial protocol. That is, that these restrictive and enabling rules that govern the internet are increasingly being fed back into wider society, into the city. But I want to really stress here that this doesn't mean that old forms of management and rule and authority have gone away. Control, discipline, and authority, the kind of rule of the king, sovereign power, these are always available. These are resources, if you like, for ordering society in various ways. So these things don't get superseded by the previous version, they just add to these kind of tools of government. So that's some sort of basic, theoretical outlines. I'll talk more about theory later. This embarrassing picture here is the kind of smart city envisaged in the pre-smart city era. Before we had smart cities so-called in the late 90s and early 2000s, this is the kind of vision you could see on the internet of the so-called cyber city. This is actually Cybertown, an early proto-platform for basically getting together, chatting, and so on. Envisaged as a kind of hybrid of the city and this virtual world. So the information society, if you remember that thing that existed in the 80s and 90s, had a number of consequences in terms of how cities were going to be imagined and created. In the 1990s in particular, there was a movement to make virtual cities, and these essentially were analogs of real cities online. So we're talking about what we now think of as websites for cities. And you can see on the top of the slide here, one such example from the city I used to live in, Newcastle in the UK, and various online portals for civic and other kind of organizations. Gradually, this kind of developed into a program of what architects call recombination. In other words, bringing this virtual city into the real world, into IRL. And this was done through all kinds of things, including kiosks. And I have this picture of, by the way, on the bottom of the Link NYC initiative, because these things have made a comeback recently. You know, internet kiosks, which existed in some cities in the 1990s, have now come back in this new form as sort of wireless portals. And of course, the other one, which we're all familiar with now, was sort of online public transport timetables and signage. These kinds of initiatives were overwhelmingly civic in their orientation and really focused on kind of making places better in many ways. And this remains a foundation of smart city initiatives in many parts of the world, particularly in Europe and the European Union, and of course in some other places. Montreal in Canada is another good example of that. This is a picture of the Operations Center in Rio de Janeiro, their smart city initiative, which we'll talk about briefly in a second. In the 1990s, we also saw a whole new set of cyber cities created in the real world. And these are largely national projects, and they used the language of the time. So one classic example is the twin city of Putrajaya and Cyberjaya in Malaysia, which was part of what was then called a multimedia super corridor. And the internet was often thought of in those days as a super highway or a super corridor or a super pipeline, all of those kind of things. But this was predating modern smart cities, which didn't really arrive until much later in the 2000s. They started really as an IBM brand. In fact, IBM still has the trademark to smart cities, smart planet, smart everything, really, a bit like McDonald's has the trademark to Mac everything. But they moved very rapidly to a generic kind of model of an urban good, you know, incorporating previous good city models. So anything you can say is good, a sustainable city, a civic city, a good city, sort of becomes incorporated into this idea of the smart city, even though it's primarily sort of technically and technologically driven. And corporations then argued really about whose expertise provided the best platform for these kind of smart cities. So IBM got in there very early and donated its platform to a lot of different places, particularly Rio de Janeiro, which I mentioned just now, which became a kind of advertising model for IBM. And indeed, the mayor of Rio de Janeiro in the mid 2000s, he was actually almost like a kind of corporate salesman for IBM, traveling the world, showing off his cyber city as it functioned. And we saw all kinds of companies move into the smart city space, from power companies, back office service providers, software companies, social media companies. Every corporation suddenly became a smart city company. We also saw the emergence of key examples like Songdo in South Korea, and of course Singapore, whose smart nation model still remains one of the archetypes. But I think it's really important to bear in mind there are parallel histories which have, you know, very much contribute to this, but are not often emphasized by people who talk about smart cities. And these include things like free ports and special investment zones, the kind of dubious places where you know, you can badge a ship or kind of maybe conduct a drug deal and no one will ask any questions. These are really important parts of the shadow economy of the world. And yet they're, you know, growing at this time alongside smart cities. One can also think of the history of leisure cities like Las Vegas or other kinds of, you know, Dubai even, which are basically places designed entirely for entertainment. Then, of course, the whole history of gated communities and exclusive cities, including things like on the bottom of this slide here, this is Alphaville, Sao Paulo, one of the many Alphaville developments in Rio de Janeiro, which essentially are whole gated cities, which allow the very wealthy to have an exclusive lifestyle away from the poor and away from the marginalized and away from other distractions. And then finally, there's a whole history of military and police urbanism, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And there's increasing convergence and hybridity between these. New kinds of smart cities in some cases, or perhaps one might say rebadging of old ideas. So how does security and surveillance fit into all this? Well, this really comes back to what I was saying about the military and police history. The 1990s brought increasing concern about the unruliness of cities and crime and urban terrorism, even though, if you look back in history, this is actually one of the best times in history for crime figures. Crime has been going down for hundreds of years, in fact. On the military side, we saw the rise of what's called military operations in urban terrain, or MOUT, which was intimately connected with the US ambitions in the Middle East and the first Gulf War and after. And the answers to these questions, whether it was in cities or in international politics, always involved digital surveillance. So for example, in policing, there was a visual and digital turn in policing that saw the rise of closed circuit television or video surveillance all over the world, particularly of course in my home state of Great Britain. And then technologies like crime mapping, developing maps of where crime was occurring or could occur, and computerized statistics models, or CompStat. This, of course, led to gradually over time more predictive policing models using much more sophisticated analysis of all kinds of statistics to predict where crime could occur or even who was likely to be a criminal. And these are still being argued about and implemented today. Of course, after 9/11, there was a demand that was created for many of these strategies for security reasons. And we saw this in the USA in particular through Homeland Security funding, where you had integration of CCTV, emergency services, and other kinds of services into so-called fusion centers. Also recombination in new forms like smart border projects. And of course, we've seen these in the EU, attempts to try to prevent migrants from crossing rivers in Greece and of course across the Mediterranean to create the so-called Fortress Europe. And things like domain awareness, these curious projects which combine military port protection with a kind of view over the city beyond. So you actually get military control seeping into the city. And there's one of these major projects in New York City at the moment, still ongoing. Now, within the mainstream of smart city projects, many of these didn't really mention security very much. This was downplayed. If it was mentioned, it was really just a minor concern about crime and security. But now what we're seeing is all of these things being integrated together in the creation of comprehensive platforms where smart cities are merely the beginning to create corporate foundations for urban life. And they include comprehensive forms of sensor devices, which will cover everything from sewage, air quality, right through to movements of people in spaces. They include drones and robots. And of course, in the back office, massive data collection, computer analytics, artificial intelligence. But they also don't just merge into these areas. It now encompasses housing and transport and all of those more conventional areas of urban life. And we'll talk about how this happens. So just to think theoretically for a second about this again, to go back to our theory. Many of these kind of visions of how smart cities will occur are, of course, still very preliminary. Many of them don't exist in the real world. And as such, you can consider them, in Brian Massumi's language, to be virtual or fantastic, or a kind of at least a socio-technical imaginary, as Jasanoff and Kim would put it. And as I've said, security is often a very uneasy component of these visions. It's very hard to have a utopia which has sort of, robot security as a key point of its offer, right? This doesn't sound good. It doesn't sound utopian. So promoters often don't acknowledge the central place of surveillance or security in their projects. But what I've been saying for a very long time now is that smart cities are inevitably surveillance cities, because this technocratic management of urban flows requires information about everything that moves in the city, including people, because you never know what's an opportunity or a threat. So everything has to be monitored, has to be watched, has to be put into the database and acted upon by AI. And I think what we're seeing now is a movement towards a much more comprehensive system. And what this system is what I'm calling a platform city. And this sees the combination of a kind of technological vision that comes through smart cities with a very much more neoliberal economic vision based on corporate ways of organizing society. So the platform city, if you like, is a kind of combination of that platform urbanism and the smart city. And I am going to talk about 5 different examples. What these examples really try to do is what SAP identified way back in the 2000s, and this is what they said about Rio de Janeiro and the IBM project there, is that the aim of these projects is to make everything better, of course, but primarily to make dumb, rude, and dirty traits of the past. In other words, you're already seeing what kind of a city they like and they don't like. And of course, for many of us, dumb, rude, and dirty is exactly what we like about cities, right? This is why many people move to cities, because there's life, because there's things that are prohibited elsewhere or you know, not available in kind of closed-minded rural townships, right? Cities are places where things happen, things that maybe even, you know, maybe even immoral or illegal. But that's what cities are all about. You know, cities are, as Walkovich said about 20 years ago, they are places of dreadful delight. And this is exactly what the smart models want to put a stop to. So what are these models, very briefly? First of all, as I said, Cyborg Toronto. Now, Cyborg Toronto was one of the most interesting proposals being made in recent years. It was by Sidewalk Labs, which was a company created or spun off by Google or Alphabet, and was headed up by Dan Doctoroff, a personal friend of Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO, and of course also former deputy mayor of New York under Mike Bloomberg. And in some ways, Sidewalk Toronto, or Sidewalk Labs, is actually a kind of make work project for ex-Bloomberg employees. It was actually quite a small project in many ways, although it had expansive ambitions. But what Eric Schmidt says about it, and he said this in an interview just after they'd won the contract, was just imagine all the things you could do if someone would just give us a city and put us in charge. Now it's our turn. In other words, corporations would take over and show governments how it was done. They said it was beyond the smart city, a city built from the internet up, a data-driven city, and all of these kind of things. But of course, it failed miserably, and we'll talk more about why that was in a second. The second example I want to briefly talk about before we bring it back together is a proposal, again, that in this case hasn't failed, but just doesn't exist yet, which is Nevada Innovation Zones. Now, this is a proposal for a new law in the state of Nevada in the USA, which would allow companies which earn a certain amount of land to form their own governments and to build their own cities. So they would be allowed to have the same authority as US counties, and that means raising taxes, running schools, as far as I can tell, running police forces as well. They would need a certain amount of investment, and they would have to promise to invest about $1 billion over 10 years to create a smart city. Now, this is the corporate vision, right? So the smart city is defined as an incubator for new technology. You can't just be any company, though. If just because you're a company with money, you can't be part of this. You have to be involved in blockchain, autonomous tech, Internet of Things, robotics, these kind of things. And I can bet there'll be all kinds of security innovation amongst these. What's really strange about this is the governance structure. They try to claim this is completely normal, right? There'll be nothing different about this government from any other government. And then they go to describe how it'll work. And there'll be a 3-person board appointed by the governor to run this place. In other words, this is like a Roman triumvirate. This is not government as you know it. You know, and they say, don't worry, it's just like Disney World. But at the same time, they say it's not a company town. I mean, it is a company town. And if it's anything like Disney World, it's like Disney World in the sense that Disney World is completely under control, completely surveilled, and completely a corporate creation. And if you think that's bad, one of the most interesting phenomena I come across recently is the expansion of American public-private partnership models and gated communities to the rest of the world. And this is the company and city called Prospero in Honduras. This company, Prospero, defines itself as an economic development platform. This actually adopts the language of platforms here. It's not me describing it as a platform. They call themselves a platform. You can become part of Prospero if you like. You can actually become an e-resident if you've got enough money. They describe themselves as semi-autonomous, but they integrate the local population. I love that term. What that actually means is there are people already living in the place where Prospero is going to be built, and they'll just have to put up with it. They're allowed to have jobs in the new place, and they'll have better pay than the general local conditions, but they're not going to be allowed to be official residents. It's going to have very light regulation. And the whole point, they say, is to enable entrepreneurs to solve problems structurally and responsibly. I actually looked at the governance documents for this entity, and it's astonishing. I mean, governance documents are really boring, but they're so important. And they're basically imitating a kind of constitutional model for this. And you can find out within these governance documents who is allowed to do various things. It turns out you can't run for leadership of this city or be on the council unless you already have business, management, or leadership experience. Your voting rights are based both on residency, but also on how much land you own. So this is not a democracy in any way of understanding it. It's much more like Plato's understanding of, in the Republic, of how citizenship would be constructed. And security, by the way, is an express basic purpose of the city. Article 10 of their charter allows the city to establish any security force it decides, including police, intelligence services, prisons, and there appears to be no limits to what is possible. And by the way, these rights are exclusive and outside of Honduran jurisdiction. So Honduras has basically agreed to carve off a bit of its own state and give it to this company, or sell it to this company. I mean, if you want an example of a neoliberal, city-state, that's what Prospero is. Fourth example is NEOM. NEOM is one of my favorites, and I'm writing an article about NEOM right now. This is this generic image, by the way, doesn't really get to the heart of how weird NEOM is. This is a proposed platform city in Saudi Arabia, based around what they call the Line, which is a 170-kilometer long linear city stretching from the Red Sea into the desert. They say it's an attempt to do something that's never been done before. And again, like Prospero, it's aimed at entrepreneurs and business leaders. Specifically, it seems white, non-Saudi Arabian entrepreneurs and business leaders. Citizens of NEOM will have to embrace, as they say, a culture of exploration, risk-taking, and diversity. By the way, diversity is a code word here. What they mean by diversity is not Muslim and not Saudi Arabian. Very important. It's got a very interesting advisory committee, which includes Dan Doctorow. Oh, Dan Doctorow, where have we heard of him before? Cyborg Labs, yes, right. And various other people, including Carlo Ratti, the very famous advocate of social physics and basically scientific management of cities, the star architect Norman Foster, and so on. And again, they claim not to be a smart city. This is about creating a different kind of living environment. And they plan to use every bit of data they can to feed it into artificial intelligence, to continuously learn and predict for everything, basically, for the benefit of populations. They've got some crazy ideas, including more than 50% of the population being robots, drone swarms, flying taxis, cloud seeding to create rain, robot cage fighting. I mean, it's bizarre. It's really one of the weirdest visions of a city I've ever seen. And of course, this is all, don't forget, in one of the most repressive countries in the world, and it's built right on the border with Egypt, Israel, and Jordan. In fact, geopolitically, it's a fascinating proposal. And I'm going to be keeping a watch on this one. Now, interestingly, security is mentioned nowhere in the materials, but elsewhere, I found documents showing how Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi Arabian ruler, effectively, has set aside massive investment for security in NEOM, including multiple surveillance drones, security operations centers, and the creation of an entirely new private security company to police the city. Last example is Super City in Japan, which is a government proposal to create cities where artificial intelligence, big data, and so on are utilized, and I say this is a quote, to resolve social problems. In other words, we're going to solve problems with AI. It's founded on this idea of complete data connection, like NEOM, a giant storehouse of data on the city's residents, which could be shared across different fields, all mediated by AI systems. And again, it's presented as being not a smart city, but beyond the smart cities, something else. It's also part of a strategic special zones plan. So remember what I said earlier about this whole history of special investment zones, special strategic zones. So in many ways, it's more like Prospero than what one would imagine for a Japanese plan in this case. Okay, final few minutes before, I don't know how long I've got actually, because I can't see any time indicators anywhere. but some of you feel free to tell me. But brief critique of these ideas. So my basic critiques of what's going on here revolve around several things. First of all, what is a platform city and what is it for? Secondly, who are the platform citizens envisaged to be? Thirdly, questions of security and surveillance in platform cities. And finally, questions of maybe more geopolitical nature about planetary security in platform cities. I'm not going to go to these in detail, don't worry, so we'll have time for questions. But there are three, I would say, broad and overlapping types of platform city that you can identify from this. They're not, they're not incommensurable. You can fit these together. Several of them have each characteristic. Some have one, some have three. The first type is what you might call a national platform. And these are platforms that reflect and support national goals and values. Maybe NEOM is like this to some extent. Certainly Super City in Japan is like this. And one might also think of Modi's plan for 100 smart cities in India, which is very much of this nature, a nationalistic plan for smart city development. The second model is the techno-corporate type of platform, which reflects those goals of technological corporations and their values. Cyborg Toronto, obviously, and the Nevada innovation zones, because that bill is entirely written by a company called Blockchain LLC. It's just a corporate plan. And thirdly, what I call the extropian model. And this is basically an idea that the platform is the only thing that the city exists for, i.e. a new corporational structure has been created just to support this new entity, and perhaps ultimately to create new types of life and new types of forms of government. And one can think of Prospero this way. It's a company and it's a city. And we can also think of Elon Musk's Mars colony this way too. It's exactly what he's proposing in a much more extreme setting, is a company which is also a city, essentially. But there's many more shared material and ideological elements, many of which are extremely worrying. One of these is the idea of separation from the surrounding polity. So these are mostly quasi-city-state models. They're drawing on the supposed good examples of Singapore or Dubai, and in fact, of course, even older examples, many of which are in Italy, Milano, Firenze, and so on from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But they're creating something very new and a very different kind of model of the city-state. Secondly, they share a kind of bland globalist aesthetics, which verges at its most extreme on kind of settler colonialism. The smooth visualizations, the smiling white people, and they are always white people, the star architects drawn from internationally famous firms, and the usual suspects on the advisory boards. Thirdly, their idea of citizenship or membership, and it is really citizenship, let's face it, is a kind of neoliberal entrepreneurial citizenship. And we'll talk more about this in a second, where democracy is de-emphasized versus financial freedom. Fourthly, as we've seen, ubiquitous data extractivism and surveillance. So this is absolutely a part of this. It's not even questioned. It's just part of the foundation of the way these things work. And fifthly, these are really an aspect, I would argue, of a resurgence and rescaling on a larger level of private, gated, or exclusive communities. So the idea of sustainable, smart, innovative, all of these words conceal a highly exclusionary and secured model. Mike Davis and Daniel Bertrand Monk talked about these kind of places in their earlier forms as evil paradises. And this is exactly what I think is a good word to describe them as. Secondly, who are the platform citizens? Who are the people going to live in these places according to these portrayals? Well, in some ways, all of these examples harness well understood smart city imaginaries. Like we all understand what a smart city looks like now, at least in its vision, but they kind of piggyback libertarian fantasies on top of them, right? So it's kind of libertarianism harnessing smart city stuff. As Dan Doctoroff said in 2018 at a meeting I went to about Cyborg Toronto, when he was asked about who would live in Cyborg Toronto, he replied, "They won't all be tech bros." Well, maybe he was right. Some of them will be finance bros and some of them will be lawyers, but basically they'll all be bros. But with even fewer, perhaps, regulations than smart cities. And of course, there'll be less Muslim, less Chinese,
I'm sorry. Dr. Murakami Wood, I think we lost you because your connection is stopping and it's fixed on your image. Can you hear us? No. So while we fix the problem, if you still have the code to Slido, please ask some questions. And as you see now, there is also the question for the attendance. So please answer that as well. And yeah, we are really curious to read out your questions. So don't hesitate to send them in on Slido. And we are trying to fix the problem. So don't worry about it. It will just be a 5-minute thing. Lo contatto su.
Ripeti anche il codice eventualmente.
Yeah.
È proprio uscito.
Yeah, for those that don't know it yet, the code for Slido is 60 58 61. No, sorry, I'm 60 51 68. That's you can see it in the slide. We just got his message that he is coming back. So don't worry about it. Okay, so you're back. You are still connecting to the audio, I think. Okay, now we have you back. So if you're able to, we don't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, okay, there was an internet failure here at this end, so sorry about that.
Yeah, don't worry.
Will I just finish off? I mean, I've got about 2 or 3 minutes more.
Yeah, yes, it's perfect. Don't worry about that. If you are able to connect again with your slides.
Yep, I'll do that now.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, we see that.
Okay, yes, right. Okay, sorry everybody, that was the inevitable hazards of Zoom society. And I live on a very small island, so our internet service here is terrible. Sorry about that. Okay, so what can we think about in terms of security? We talked about what are the platform cities, who are the platform citizens, and now I want to just briefly address the question of security in platform cities. First, thinking about Foucault's idea of biopolitics, that is the inclusive management of citizens. And then I'll talk a little bit afterwards about necropolitics, about the exclusionary possibilities of these places. So first of all, these ostensibly small government libertarian platform cities mask increasingly distributed and networked technologies of security and governance. And this is part, I think, of a kind of typical sort of post-panoptic control society, which sees what the proliferation of what Bruno Latour called oligoptica. This is like very intense places of surveillance, you know, in the islands of almost no surveillance. So we go through places which are extremely under surveillance and other places which have none. At the same time as well, we also see this attempt by surveillance to secure itself. I won't go into this now, but it's a much more complicated idea. At the same time, we're less able to see the surveillance that's watching us. So the overt becomes covert. What used to be visible in terms of cameras and all that, and police, starts to be built into the very fabric of the cities themselves. And if security, as Foucault argued, is the primary purpose of government, in this context, in the platform city, security can be in anything. Security can be anything. In other words, government itself can be ambient, that is all around us and part of our environment. So platform cities in that sense come with not so subtle forms of socialization and behavioral conditioning built in to the actual fabric of the cities themselves. Of course, security components, as we said, are not advertised as part of this mostly. You have to dig into the industry publications to find announcements and contracts, but they're all highly securitized in their conception, all of these platform cities. They're financially and socially exclusionary. These are not open to everybody. As we've seen, they're open only to kind of, you know, entrepreneurial citizens, the Homo economicus. They're implicitly racialized and sometimes overtly racialized, even eugenic in their portrayals in some cases. They're metaphorically, at least, sometimes legally, and sometimes physically walled and gated. In that sense, they are highly controlled. In this sense, the security and policing objects are mainly outside the city, not inside. So it's really a case of keeping out threats than actually policing threats inside. So the security and the surveillance, if you like, is demanded or supported by the residents in order to secure themselves against envious others outside of the city. However, I've seen some interesting hints in some of these proposals at a kind of social credit style. And what I mean by this is Chinese model of social credit, which assesses citizens and rewards or punishes them based on their performance or views. And at least in the Japanese super city model and in some of the others, there are some hints of the idea of assessment with consequences from this data collection. Mostly talking about rewards, that you can be rewarded for good behavior if your data is assessed in a certain way. But you can bet that where there's rewards, there's also punishment. Platforms themselves, of course, seem designed to encourage security and surveillance innovation. And this is made explicit in the case of NEOM, although less explicit in others. And this is actually where I'm going to direct some future research, is trying to tease out some of these issues of how security and surveillance innovation takes place in these models. Just finally, I would note that all of these platform cities, without exception, advertise themselves not just as smart, but as sustainable. Now, the Indian environmentalist Vandana Shiva long ago argued that we'd lost the real meaning of sustainability. But here, in these contexts, it becomes a code. Really what it is just part of an aesthetic politics of marketing. It doesn't mean anything. And in some senses, platform cities are a kind of form of incipient war against the planet. They're a mode of geopolitics. They are creating emerging conflicts, especially with the planet itself. There's a fundamental belief, for example, that the platform economy is a clean economy, but the environmental effects of this platform economy, as we're already seeing with things like Bitcoin and blockchain technologies more generally, is merely externalized either to distant places, of course, or to the future in the case of climate change. So you can see this, with research on energy use in server farms. You can see this with the recycling scams and lakes of plastic waste in China, all this kind of stuff. This, if you like, is the kind of environmental political impact of these sorts of things. In that sense, parts of the separation and the necropolitical, biopolitical split that we're seeing here with these cities is the clean, sustainable inside and the environmentally degraded, unlivable outside. And there again, this is exactly where it connects to Elon Musk's Mars vision, right? Abandon Earth to its environmental destruction, leave the planet and form this new, clean, libertarian paradise. And in many ways, that's exactly what is being advertised with these cities. And that's all I have to say today. Sorry for the interruption.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Murakami Wood. We really enjoyed your speech, and I think you were able to actually put into a few words and a very simple discourse such a complicated topic. It's been really interesting to me, and I think for all our audience, especially because you really gave it an interdisciplinary approach in the sense that whether we are political sciences, philosophy, or sociology students, or even IT students, we were able to really catch the meaning of what you said. So that's really great. And in fact, I never thought of the role of a smart city like what you said, because it gave me like a sort of Orwellian sort of sense, in the sense that there's a lot of positive words that you use, such as benefits, services for the population, prosperity, and so on. However, we must be conscious that there is something else to think about, such as all the things that we are giving up for our benefits. Basically, that was the main topic of your presentation, and it's really a standoff between this utopia, this beautiful utopia, and the realism of your presentation. So yeah, my final thoughts are that really smart is usually really good perspective and word. However, we should really be aware of the power exchange that goes beyond the word smart, between like companies and government and governance and citizens and so on. And I really thank you for your speech. I think we have a few questions now. So we will go to the questions by the public right now. Okay, there you go. So we have the first three questions. Do you prefer to answer them individually, or can I have three questions and then you answer them together?
Well, some of them I think, well, it depends. I mean, some of them I could answer very quickly. I mean, they're all on different subjects. It's probably best if I answer them individually, I think.
Okay, let's have it individually. So the first question by Molinari is, do you believe that COVID has contributed to the normalization of new forms of control, even in democracies? And I personally think this is a really interesting question, because it's really the time that we are living. And during your presentation, I even thought continuously about COVID and its consequences on us.
Yeah, well, yes and no. I think undoubtedly it has to some extent. Although what I'm going to say is, I think also not as much as many of us were expecting. I think it depends what you mean by control in this context, because for example, the far right of American politics, in fact, well, just the right of American politics, would have you believe that having to wear a mask is a form of control, right? So for some people, that's a completely unthinkable thing that they should never be allowed to do. And yet, I live half my life in Japan. My family is half Japanese, and that's where I live. And masks are perfectly normal there. Whenever you have a cold, or if you have to go to work, you put your mask on, you go to work. It's not considered to be a form of control. It's just a way of being polite and looking after your fellow workers and friends and everything else. So I think it depends to some extent on where we're standing and how we're looking at that. And for example, I would never go as far as Giorgio Agamben for example, the Italian philosopher, legal philosopher, who I think has gone completely over the top with his critiques of COVID control. I think he's lost it, basically. You know, there's some of the ideas that all of this is about some, you know, basically sinister plot to control people. I mean, there's a, you know, a lot of people, I have my books behind me that actually use them. A lot of people, for example, are trying to say that this, you know, plan, which is the plan of the World Economic Forum, is a kind of sinister conspiracy, you know, to impose new forms of government on us. It's not. This is just neoliberalism as it's always been. They're just trying to say we should restart neoliberalism. And that's, you know, that is a conspiracy in a sense, but it's not the kind of, you know, the kind of nefarious underhand control that you might imagine. On the other hand, there are some particular technologies that we've seen sort of sneaking into the debate about COVID. So you've seen the use, for example, of surveillance robots in Singapore and in other places. You know, the first time we've seen these dog-like robots on the streets. Seen it in New York and Singapore. That's a new thing, and that's certainly been, the excuse has been COVID. And I don't think they've been yet normalized because people are still very worried about them. But certainly the first stage of normalization is to see these things helping us in the streets and in public parks. There's also a big debate, of course, about vaccine passports. You know, and that's an interesting thing too, because many people don't remember that we've had vaccine passports of various kinds for a very long time. You know, if you're going to parts of Africa, you still need yellow fever vaccine documents. You know, we've got all kinds of vaccine documents. This isn't an entirely new thing. The question is whether they're digitized, whether they're linked to other forms of database, and whether they then start to, you know, play into other sorts of aspects of control of our lives. And I think at the moment, all we can say is we don't know. Many countries have just rejected these systems completely. Some haven't. So yes and no is the answer.
Okay, thank you very much also for your analysis of the word control, which is really interesting. The second question is by Michela. She is asking, what do you think about SARI, the Italian system of facial recognition that was recently found to be not in compliance with EU privacy legislation? I do not know if you are familiar with that, I suppose so, but in just the case, you can also talk in general about recognition that is not in compliance with privacy.
Yeah, it's actually been a long time since I was doing research on facial recognition back in 2003 and 2004, so it's been a long time. SARI, I don't know so much about specifically, but what I can say is that facial recognition systems in general, whenever they've been implemented at national levels or at urban levels, they've generally been in trouble in court, and not just with the EU privacy legislation. So just recently, you may have heard of, in Canada, there was a judgment against a company called Clearview AI, which is another private facial recognition company that was selling its software to police forces across Canada, across the USA. And that was ruled to be, again, not in compliance with Canadian privacy law at all. So I think, and there's been a pushback because civic organizations in Europe and in North America in particular have been pushing back against facial recognition. It's been very organized, it's been very effective. And I think what's really important about this is a key moment right now. You know, we knew facial recognition was coming since around 2000, right? We've known for 20 years it's on the way. But like right now is the time where it's mature as a technology, it can be used. So we've got to stop it, basically. And I think this means that it's exactly the right time to be taking court challenges, to be launching campaigns, to be making sure that this technology does not go into widespread use for this purpose. There's many, you know, absolutely fine purposes for facial recognition, but not, you know, for example, in public streets, you know, basically constituting a widespread search of the population. And certainly not when we get into the more controversial uses, which talk about things like emotion recognition or trying to determine whether somebody is a certain kind of person. You know, there was a really offensive claim in one of paper recently that, you know, they could predict if someone was homosexual or not, you know, for looking at facial recognition, using facial recognition technologies and analysis. These things are completely bogus claims anyway, but imagine if these are put into widespread use, right? You know, once they're in use, it's very difficult to get rid of them. So we need to stop them before they get into widespread use. So that's what I think.
Okay, thank you for your answer. If I can say my own comment here, I think that really we trust our phones with facial recognition in all daily lives, basically, and then we really complain about any other system of sort of control. And we should therefore really think about what we mean by privacy and by safety and by trusting, you know, technology and technological elements. And your answer was really explanatory in that. So we can actually pass to the next question, which is by Giulio Mattioli. Couldn't it be that the private sector may offer more efficient and secure city life than a common public city? So does technology actually offer a safer environment than person-made government? I think that's the sense of the question.
Well, the simple answer to that, and you're going to be surprised here, is yes. But that's not the point, right? That's the danger of it. It doesn't offer it for everybody. The problem with these private sector models is they're not for everybody. They take the people who are already the most secure, the wealthiest, the people who are able, you know, essentially, the most protected in society, and give them more, right? Offer them more protection, more security, more of everything, and leave others outside. So yes, sure, they're very efficient. They probably have a very secure model. And you've got to remember that there's two sort of fundamental entwined characteristics of how surveillance and how security works in contemporary society. And those are the ones I called earlier on, biopolitics and necropolitics. What that means in this context is security and surveillance is demanded by one group of people for their protection and then imposed on the others for their exclusion. And so those two dynamics, work together. So yes, it's efficient, it's secure for a small percentage of people.
Thank you so much. And directly connected to this question, there's actually the question by someone that we don't know the name of, which is, do you think that these projects will deepen the gap between rich countries and developing one? Because you told about nationalities and about ethnicities and so on. However, between rich countries and developing one.
Well, yes, and it's more complicated than that, even more complicated than that. They will do. But what they'll also do, as we can see with the model of Prospero and Honduras, is they will end up with poorer countries selling off parts of themselves, to basically create these kinds of cities. That's exactly what's happened in the Honduras case in Prospero. Essentially, the Honduran government has sold an island. It's what the first Prospero site is, to this company, because it's a poor country. They've sold this island. And so what we're going to see is countries giving up little bits of their, sovereign state in order to fund these kinds of projects, to create these kind of projects, sorry. So we're going to have this, I think this has been happening for a long time with things like special investment zones and enterprise zones and all this kind of stuff, but it's going to get even more so. We'll see a really complicated geography emerging, where it's not so much about rich countries and poor countries, as about rich enclaves and a poor world.
Okay, thank you so much. I was really impacted by your last sentences, rich enclaves and poor world. But I'm confident we can actually solve the situation through a little bit of work and coordination between nations. I'm very positive about that.
I hope you're right. I've been campaigning for 20 years on environmental human rights issues, and yeah, maybe I'm more pessimistic because of that. But yeah, we thought in 1990 when the World Summit on Environment Development took place in Rio that was the beginning of a better world, and it wasn't.
Well, I mean, the participants that are in this call and the ones that are with me in this room, I think we can be the beginning of a.
I hope so. I'm really backing.
Well, let's find out about that in the next 20 years, let's say. We can have the last question before going to the speaker. So let's have the question by Alex Frattin. Could such cities transform into ad hoc safe harbors designed to evade jurisdiction? And how will their existence interact with international governance? So this is a question about sovereignty and about the effectiveness of a government in these smart and platform cities.
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think this is one where, if you're interested in this question, there's some really good research that needs to be done here, because I think one of the reasons I've started reading the charters and the proposed constitutions for these cities is precisely for this reason. And I think it's very different depending on which place we're talking about. So Neom, for example, while it is supposedly a kind of special economic zone and a freer environment than the rest of Saudi Arabia, is still very much under the control of Saudi Arabia. So in that sense, it's not going to be, it's not going to be a kind of lawless free port outside of the, any jurisdiction. It's actually very much part of Saudi Arabia. But in that case, that's no comfort, right? Because Saudi Arabia is an incredibly repressive government with an authoritarian and violent, form of rule. So that may not be a comfort to people who live there. On the other hand, Prospero is very much the opposite, right? It's a slice of Honduras. It's essentially been sold off. They have one very interesting clause in the charter, which I can't remember exactly, but I can tell you about it, which says, what kind of external help Prospero can ask for. So essentially, it's basically to what extent can it have a foreign policy? And it's very clear that it can have any kind of policing help that it wants from any other place in the world, but no military help. So it's just on the edge of being a completely independent country, right? It's not in itself a perfect city-state. But on the other hand, it can have its own intelligence service. They said that in the charter. So, it's where is sovereignty located? What constitutes sovereignty in this context? The sovereignty that Prospero is planning to have is so comprehensive in other ways. It seems, almost besides the point that it can't have a military. I mean, Costa Rica doesn't have a military, and that's a country as well, right? So, it's, again, I think this is a very difficult thing. The other question is about international jurisdiction. Like, what are these things in international terms, right? If somebody invaded Prospero, what would happen? If Honduras invaded Prospero, what would happen? Would it be an international incident, or would it be a purely national issue? If the people of Neom rose up and demanded their own, kind of government outside of Saudi Arabia, what would happen? Essentially, up to a point, these are independent, or at least have the illusion of independence, these kind of some of these cities, but they're not in the end as independent as they seem. But also, they're not designed to, I think Neom, for example, is not designed to have permanent residents. Like Dubai and like other cities, which rely on a continuous churn of residents, right? Continuous churn of foreign residents moving in and out. I think it's a very similar idea. You'll get people coming in, doing some things, moving out again. And I don't think it really seems like it's the kind of place you want to live. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm not the kind of person that Neom is aimed at.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your answers and your intervention. That was really, really interesting. And this
great question.
Yeah, yes, definitely. This trip into this new world has been really, really exciting and really full of information that for sure we can use in the next future for ourselves, and having a little bit of critical thinking about that and finding new solutions to these very contemporary problems. So really thank you for that, for everything. Those that are invited to the Meet the Speakers will find the link in their chat, and